Welcome back, Magma Munchers. It's your favorite marketable plushie, Magma. Let's talk about the state of the game. It's no secret that there are a few problems with Arcane Odyssey, the community, the constant lack of content, the bugs, and the direction the game is headed, which is very disappointing as this game has so much potential, and it's even more disappointing speaking with people and finding out they barely play the game now, or have just outright quit the game. Vetex, in his Discord server, posted this little rant, and I'm gonna talk about the state of the game in response to what he said here. He did post this a little while ago now, so I'm kind of like Ninja dragging the low taper fade meme. Don't worry, this video is scripted, so I won't be wasting your time with pointless yap. I want to make it very clear that I'm not trying to put Vetex down with this video. Arcane Odyssey has a lot of potential and I want it to succeed. I'm sure Vetex will appreciate honest, good-faith criticism over pretty lies. I'm a YouTuber, a programmer, and most importantly a player who enjoys the game for what it has to offer. Vetex and Tech are both really cool guys and I would love to get to speak to them sometime. So with that all said, let's finally talk about the game. Arcane Odyssey, truly one of the Roblox games of all time. In Vetex's Discord server he posted this rant. Firstly, it's important to clarify who this is directed at, and it's the PvPers, but not just the ones that gank you the moment you spawn in, specifically the vocal minority that go the extra step to just, well as Vetex put it, be toxic, complain and just doom post, complain about every little thing. It's also important to note that since this is basically formatted as an open letter, it also serves as a warning to you, the person reading it. But anyways, right off the bat, Vetex is being very Sigma and trying to call out the bad part of the community, and power to him. Anyways, we'll touch more on this shortly and move on to what he says next. Well, I'm glad Vetex does acknowledge that the game does need PvP or it would die out, and a huge reason for that is because of the lack of content and replayability. Outside of grinding, the only thing there is to do is just PvP, so the game kind of forces itself into this situation where it's dependent on PvP or it would just lose players. Content is what attracts players to the game, replayability is what actually retains those players. Arcane Odyssey having very little replayability mechanics is actually criminal and is a huge factor in why this game feels so dry most of the time. For example, there are plenty of builds in this game which unfortunately to experience you need to sink a lot of time just to level up a new slot to max just to try it out. It's stuff like this that needs to be built on so the game can actually retain its players and not just leave the toxic PvPers left. I'm sure you've noticed a trend where after the hype for an update, the player count immediately drops. There's just no replayability to keep the people playing after experiencing the content. Arcane Odyssey just really lacks both new content and replayability, and Vetex knows this. In the Mistral update patch notes, Vetex said he wants to focus more on adding replayability, and if you look at the Trello, there is a lot of content that will eventually get added. It's just gonna take time, so we just have to let Vetex cook. While on the topic of time, we were told in the Q&A that we can expect monthly updates from then on out. 2 months later, we then get a very small update, the Mistral update, which was below expectations. There's just this pattern of expectations never being met, and that negatively affects the player base. In the Nimbus C Part 1, Vetex said the updates were gonna ramp up going forward. Come the next update, we get even less content. Vetex did give his reasons for this, and as a programmer myself, development is inherently time-consuming and can be unpredictable, but whatever the reasons, it's still something that players will notice and pick up on, and it's what leads to players being toxic, complaining and doom posting. I myself am very hopeful that things will actually ramp up, and I understand that Vetex is human and like me, we're both probably very busy with our own things, so I'm just pointing out how this affects players who won't be as understanding. A big thing Vetex should work on is getting better at setting expectations. I can definitely tell Vetex is trying to be understanding and make the most of the situation he's in, but it's obvious this puts him in situations where he ends up saying certain things and setting certain expectations that don't give him enough wiggle room to comfortably accomplish things, and then is held accountable by players who point it out. I see this a lot being a programmer myself. The last thing I want to point out about this part of his rant is how he uses the word hotfix. Hotfix implies that the issue will be fixed relatively quickly, but most of the time we end up just waiting days, weeks, if not a whole update's worth of time until an issue gets fixed, and by that point the issue becomes something that you just can't not complain about. The only time things ever get hotfixed in a reasonable amount of time are when they are really urgent, but even then, that's very rare. I remember right after the weapon wipe bug, Vetex just went AFK instead of making any additional hotfixes to help players out. Do you know how bad that looks? Just leaving when everyone is upset that they just lost their valuable weapons. Anyways, moving on. It's just very sad to read that Vetex doesn't interact with his community anymore, even if Roblox is toxic like he put it. Come on, that's still not a good reason to just abandon your community. Again, it's just not a good look saying this, even if it's justified. Looking at Vetex's forum history, you can just see him replying to negative things a lot, which first of all isn't really good for your mental health just being stuck in this negative loop, but it also just heavily influences your outlook of your community, and it clearly has, cause now Vetex barely even interacts with his community. I know it's hard to not reply to certain negative comments, especially when you just want to make something very clear, but it really is just best to ignore it and focus on the good parts of your community. You know, the people who aren't trying to be toxic, complain and doom post and just shit on every little thing about this game. Honestly, Vetex and the team should do more Q&As and interact with the community more. Stuff like that really just humanizes the team and Vetex. When you're able to talk to the developers and see them as actual people, then that really goes a long way in having an actual loyal fan base and drowning out the toxic parts of the community. Now onto what he said about YouTubers. It's worth me bringing up the fact that as a YouTuber, you want people to click on your videos and watch the content you make. And the best way to do that is to clickbait and exaggerate, which leads to videos being very doom posty.
Guys,
Vetex just
changed his
name to Ass Cheek or whatever it is now.
This game is
Playable.
Arcane Odyssey content is really just yapping and content farming patch notes, builds, and every little thing possible. I know this because 1, I'm a YouTuber myself, and 2, I have basic human pattern recognition skills. The lack of new content just means the only thing YouTubers can yap about are the patch notes or whatever little thing pops up, and that then leads to YouTubers making videos about topics they know nothing about, spreading misinformation or whatever it may be. That's just the way it is, and really the only thing you can do is just not consume the content you don't like. On to the next part of his rant. He says that the game will never have combat focused updates. This is a little bit weird, as what is a combat focused update? You could say that each update has its own combat focused aspects, like balancing changes that affect PvP. The next update is about clans and clan v clan interaction, which is inherently a PvP focused aspect of the game. So does that make the next update combat focused? One of the patch notes for this update literally says this, and talks about reverting it if it's too toxic or makes the game too PvP focused. It is a little contradictory to say the game won't get combat focused updates. It just feels like Vetex said this to really annoy the PvPers of this game. I'll come back to this later. The next part about the balance dock being too large is true, and it's ridiculous. It obviously does take away from time that could have been spent on developing other aspects of the game. The balance dock really just doesn't need to be as big as it is most of the time, but at the same time, 1, there are a lot of things that need to be fixed that end up being neglected that the balance dock has to point out, and 2, there is just so much to balance that the dock ends up becoming really big, and when you don't implement it all, people are gonna complain, especially when you need to implement the entire balance dock, as a lot of the changes in there will only make the game balanced if all the other changes are also added. The balance dock is really funny because it's the way the team communicates with Vetex. In fact, if you look at the balance dock, you can see them trying to communicate with Vetex in a number of ways. The funniest being these Vetex keys. The balance dock is a huge topic, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but what I am going to say is if we had a better balance team, the docks wouldn't be so huge. The balance dock does feel very over-engineered with the amount of changes trying to be made. There really doesn't need to be so many many balancing changes, and a more competent team can make the balance dock much smaller, but with the current team and their current processes alongside the build-up of bugs and inconsistencies in the game, the balance dock is kind of pushed into being this really large, overwhelming thing. Even if certain changes don't affect 90% of the player base, it's still worth spending the time to address it and refine out the inconsistencies, instead of letting them pile up and in turn make the balance dock bigger and bigger. And about people saying this game is doomed when the most insignificant thing is skipped, again, things in the balance dock really shouldn't be skipped for reasons I just discussed. This last part is also concerning as you're just isolating a whole portion of the player base. The PvPers aren't just limited to the toxic doom posting ones Vetex is trying to address with this rant. I'll get more into this further into Vetex's rant. Moving on, this is true, 90% of players would not be better testers, but that's besides the point. The fact is the testers aren't doing that great of a job, which is why people say they can do a better job. Seriously, the amount of bugs that make it into the game that could have easily been caught if the testers just played the game a little bit is insane. I understand there are differences between the testverse and main game, and obviously not every bug will be caught, but seriously, bugs like the ship flinging bug where you get banished to the dark sea somehow was not caught even though it was so common. I lost so many galleons to that bug from dying and going back to the hotfix thing. These bugs just don't get hotfixed in a reasonable time frame, and it's very frustrating, leading to players complaining. Even Vetex says that the game breaking ones are fixed less than a week after updates anyways, so what makes a bug game breaking? Because bugs like the ship flinging bug most certainly can be considered game breaking, but it wasn't fixed in less than a week. And whatever these game breaking bugs are that do get fixed in less than a week, they have to be brought up by the players who experience the bugs, ruining the game's enjoyment for them just to get fixed, and like always, this leads to players complaining. I'm not concerned over the sheer number of testers. Obviously Vetex can make anyone he wants a tester, his friends, whoever, it doesn't matter, but it does matter when you have so many, but not even a small amount can catch even the most basic bugs. This game really needs better testers for the sake of the player base. This part here is the most disappointing part of this whole rant. Even if it is true that you don't owe your players anything as it is your own game to develop, it's in your best interest to cater to your player base, as they are your players who give your game enough success to let you keep making it. Even if this is directed at the toxic doom posting PvPers, which is what this whole rant is directed at, it still applies indirectly to everyone reading it, and this is just sad to read and doesn't look good on Vetex. The next part about doing enough of the balance dock is just not true, so the next part about people complaining and crying to the point of the public balance Discord's general chat being closed down is to an extent justified. The chat probably didn't need to be shut down, even if a lot of people are messaging and spamming. Shutting it down just shows how improperly managed the balance Discord is. People complaining when certain parts of the balance dock aren't added is expected, as it's in the balance dock and the balance dock is meant to be added in its entirety. Otherwise, why even bother having a whole team make an entire balance document? Vetex saying he does enough to make sure the game is stable is debatable, as stable really isn't the right word to use. Saying stable implies the balance document is also used to fix bugs, and that's not the point of a balance document, but that's just how it is, and it's very reflective of the game and its overall state. With the next part of the rant, again, it's just kind of sad to read. Even if it is directed at the toxic doom posting PvPers, saying you're not gonna change your update routine just comes across as very stubborn. Saying you do more than you'd like to in each update for these players is also very stubborn. Again, it's in your best interest to cater to your players. These toxic doom posting PvPers are just a small portion of your normal PvPers and other players, so singling them out and not making content for them is also not making content for a lot of other players. Now, about the last part of the rant, I just want Vetex to know that he doesn't need to say sorry for just expressing how he feels. I personally am not going to judge someone for just being human and saying how they feel. Now, obviously me saying that after making this video criticizing him, sounding very cynical and like I'm shitting on him, obviously will be very contradictory. So again, I just want to make it clear that I'm not trying to shit on Vetex. I'm just trying to make good faith criticism, and even though it is very blunt blunt and harsh. I'm sure Vetex will appreciate brutal honesty over me telling pretty lies. The last thing I want to bring up in relation to this is the community's response to this. Obviously, basically every Arcane Odyssey YouTuber milked the shit out of this response, me included with this video now, but what I want to bring up in particular is how a lot of players are now being very touchy when talking about the game now that Vetex posted this rant, and that's just not healthy for the game. Vetex posting this is kind of a double-edged sword, as on one hand it's important that he just tells us how he feels and stands up for himself against the bad parts of the community. On the other hand, making this kind of response will make the community more polarized. Either way, I'm glad Vetex made this post, and I strongly urge Vetex to post more as well as host more Q&As and just begin to interact with his community more. As a final note for this video, I'm gonna say that I'm very hopeful for this game and things will ramp up. Even if it does take time and it has its ups and downs, this game has a lot of potential and I can't wait to see this game evolve. Vetex, thank you for all the work you put in to make Arcane Odyssey what it is today. Have a great rest of your day, my fellow viewer. I'll see you in the next one.
Brand new.